Glad to be here. Glad to see you again. Many old friends met this year here, many new faces. So last year I talked about game jam participation and such community activities. And this time the talk is more tech related. In short, I'm going to explain how to get all those beautiful beautiful animation, what algorithms to use, what models, and how to use real physics models to achieve such some interesting gameplays in your games. So these are the gifts from my projects, and there will be more, and I will explain how to what models to use to achieve such effects. So, as for me, I'm Alexey Izvalov. I work at FGL as Developer Relations. It's a community of mobile game developers. Also, I run Global Game Jam in Ukraine and Eastern Europe. And as my own game developer studio, it is a report for which I released about 30 games, which won about 15 awards at different portals. So perhaps you saw me as General or FGL Alexey at such nicknames at the forums. So, my story, I'm gonna start with a very interesting case, and which can give much food for thought. Once I checked Google Play winners of Google Play Indie Fest, and it appeared that the third place was the game Orbit, which by High-Key Games. And it gained about 10 million of installs in Play Market, which is really significant. And the idea of the game is such. There is a center of mass, like a star. There can be several stars. And the player's task is to launch planets. And the planets will orbit this center or will orbit them all. And the player's task is to launch as many planets as possible without collisions with the stars. Just when I saw this game, it was in 2016, if I remember correct. I just was like, I had to be on the place of this developer. Because when I learn every programming language, I make several samples just to understand how the things work. And in 2010, when I was learning ActionScript 3 Flash, I created the engine like this. You launch a planet around a center of masses. But for me, it was just a sample to learn things, to implement physics correctly. But it appeared that such engine had a potential for mobile to get the mobile player's attention. As I researched this question a bit further, I was not so much sad, because it appeared that many developers, big studios, small studios, used gravity in their games. One of the oldest samples is a game where you launch a satellite and it should survive as long as possible without collision with the planets. It was 2008. In 2009, 2010, there was very successful title, Gravity Wars. Perhaps many of you saw them at Congregate with tens of millions of plays. Even Angry Birds used gravity theme, gravity setting in their Angry Birds space. But that time, it was already 2012, so many tutorials appeared how to implement gravity in your game. But you know what? They all don't work really correctly. In all those tutorials, a body 2D body is created where the gravity will take effect. Some formulas which resemble gravity with a very big mistake appear. To some objects the gravity just didn't affect. And what I want to show first in my presentation is how to model gravity correctly in your game and how to build entertaining gameplay on this. So Newton in 17th century discovered by observing that if there are two bodies, there is such a force between them, which depends on the distance and the masses of the bodies. So how to use this law to model movement of the bodies, of the objects? If we have some system of objects, physical object, it has coordinate, it has speed, and it has acceleration. They're connected as derivative. So speed shows how quick the coordinate is changing, and acceleration shows how quick the speed is changing. But the force tells us what acceleration is. So to know the speed by acceleration and to know the coordinate by the known speed, we should do the inverse operation called integration. So this reminds me of a joke in the popular self-taught programmers group on Facebook. When it's often such a discussion emerges, what sections, what questions from math does a game developer or does a programmer in general should know? And there is such an anecdote about a former student who meets the professor of math, and they say, hello, hello. So the professor asks, so did my lessons of math give you something good in your life? Oh, yes, professor, I have a very interesting case how your lessons of math helped me in my life. Oh, tell me, I will tell my today's students. One day I was walking at the street and a blow of wind, heavy gust of wind appeared, it blew, and my hat went off my head. My hat went off my head right to the pool, and I couldn't get it. But I recollected you told about integrals. So I took a wire, made a hook of it, and I grabbed my head out of the middle of the pool. So, but really, integration is not a very difficult task, and we can even do this without knowing what is integration. So what's the basics of such of modeling the movement? And every movement, we have a time step, which is defined by frame rate or defined by how often we calculate the coordinates. So time in computer, time is always discrete. So we find this, the force which acts at the body. Then we define acceleration. And as we know acceleration, then we will know velocity, speed. And as we know velocity, we will know next coordinate at the next frame, if I can say it. So if we have like 5 bodies, then we need to make 20 calculation for each body to calculate the force from each other 4. But here is one catch. If we use these formulas and use them in our game, the trajectory of a planet over around a mass center will look like this. So not something we see from astronomy or from pictures about planets and asteroids. So it appears that these formulas give a certain amount of error which is aggregating, and we need to eliminate this error. For this, another method of integration appears. It's called leapfrog integration. And its idea is such: we first define not the velocity at the end of the time interval. However, it is very small, but the velocity of the beginning of this frame, it differs from the velocity of the end of one frame. So we define an average velocity. Then we apply this average velocity to define the coordinate. And after that, we define the final velocity and return to the next step. Then we will get correct trajectories of bodies. And one more note about this modeling approach to this modeling. There is such term as computational complexity. It is very often when computers become more powerful and more memory, more powerful central processor unit, the developers tend to neglect the amount of calculations needed to do something. But the speed of the rate of the growth of the number of calculations is very important. So what does it mean, computational complexity for this case? If we have 5 bodies, then we will need to make 5 multiplied by 4, 20 calculations. But what if we have 50 bodies? Then we will need to make 50 multiplied by 49. So it will be so almost like 50 by 50, a little bit less than 2,500 calculations. So if the number of elements grows 10 times, then the number of calculations grows 100 times. So it's proportional to the square, the second power of the number of elements. So, but it won't allow us to model some very big systems. But there is a solution. As we remember from physics, Newton only noticed the rule of the gravity. He didn't say why the objects are attracted to each other. Only Einstein explained with gravity theory that the space is curved by the masses, and therefore this curved space affects the other masses to be attracted. So what if we use the Einstein's approach and model not the forces between the objects, but we will model the effect from the object to the space, just changing the space curvature. And then the space will affect the objects again. In this case, we will need to make two runs. First, we calculate the effect of the object to the surrounding space. And then we run through all the bodies to define the effect, how will their acceleration will change. In this case, the computation complexity will be all from the first power of n. Like if we have 5 objects, then we have 10 calculations. If we have 50 objects, then we will have 100 calculations. 10 times more objects, only 10 times more calculations, not 100 times. So it's so these two approaches in philosophy, they're called when we come to the essence or we come to the view. Newton noticed how the gravitation looked like, and Einstein wanted to find what is the essence of gravity. So how exactly can we implement this approach? The space will be also fractured by cells, and each node of a cell will contain the vector of the gravity force in this cell, in this point. So first, on the first run, we erase all the vectors and run through the bodies and define which body affects and with which force affects each cell node. And after that, we define which force acts to the body inside the cell. We can use interpolation coefficients, like knowing four vectors, we define the vector at any point of the cell. If we win something, then we lose something. Usually in algorithms, it will need more memory to store the space. But it is useful if we have a number of nodes bigger than the number of planets, then this pays off. So, but historically for me, implementation of this gravity was not the first implementation of this approach, like space and particles. But the first approach, the first implementation was modeling the snow, and the whole model works the same as with the gravity, but with the snow. So it was, as far as I remember, 2009 or so. The winter was snowless, and I just wanted to see snowflakes, at least on the screen of my computer. So first I started drawing snowflakes right on the screen with a computer program, but then I wanted to move them with the mouse. So this program works the same. We have a grid with force vectors, so these vectors can be like wind speeds. When the player swipes the finger, the vectors are changed along the path of the swipe, and this wind drags the snowflakes. What's the difference here is that the snowflakes don't affect each other, so it was easier to implement. But also, you see one more effect is how they stick together when they reach the ground. So there were two grids, like grid of free snowflakes and a grid of settled snowflakes, like stick to the ground. And when a snowflake reaches the zone, it also sticks, and such a snow tree starts growing. So having this approach, we can use it in many variations. So for example, we can start thinking, what if gravity worked other way, some more interesting way than it works now? For example, we can imagine a world where planets at certain distances attract, at other distances they detract, repel. So we can see how will the orbits look like. If you are a narrator designer, you can use this to imagine what civilization will live in this solar system. How will they explore their space, their outer space, what difficulties, and perhaps in some conditions, it will be easier for them to get to other planets. So it has many variations once you implement the correct physical model. And also here is just for information, it is made in HTML5, just put a static image with, as far as I remember, 10,000 planets, and they were orbiting quite nicely around each other. So, and back to the snow. So once having the snow engine, this allowed me to implement multiple gameplays and releasing one version after another. So it was 2011, winter of 2011. At that time, I could let the player move snowflakes with a swipe of mouse, not the swipe of a finger, because there were no touch screens widespread, but with movement of a mouse. So I started thinking what gameplays could be used atop of this model. So first gameplay was, after that relaxed game in 2008, this gameplay was competitive. So the player's task was to grow snow tree as high as possible. So, but how to implement challenge here? I started thinking that the player would have a limited number of snowflakes, and whoever grows the snow tree higher is the winner. So I implemented achievements, scoring system here, submitted it to Congregate. It is then in 2011 it was one of the primary portal where game developers submitted their creations, and this game got reviewed by JS Games. Now this site is closed; they don't work anymore. But at that time, being reviewed as JS Games was such a renouncement from the industry, so that the game was noticed by the industry. And it was, as far as I remember, number 2 in Newgrounds rating. So, and back to the gameplay. How to stimulate the player to get more besides the achievements. There are such gifts, and when you get the gift, you get extra snowflakes. So the top players grew snowflake about like 100 screens higher, checked from the statistics. Another approach, another implementation of snow engine. What if we can use the snowflakes, but what if we use it as defense? So it's a game, Winter Abduction, HTML5 game. So it was 2014-15 when everyone started making for HTML5. So we have the same engine, but we're now using these snowflakes as a weapon to fight against the aliens who want to steal their Christmas presents. So the same engine, but it helps us work with more various gameplays. And various enemy types, various with various abilities, and the player's task is to get the most known to them and hit as strong as possible. At that time, at the conference in 2015, when I was showcasing it, an Apple representative came to my stand and said, "Hey, your snow looks like a swarm of bees. Why don't you make a game about bees?" So I thought, why not? And there I collaborated with an artist, George Zarqua, with whom we made several games before. And here again, the same engine with grids, with particles as bees, and the player is ruling the swarm of bees with swipes already as mobile, and fights bosses, launches storm waves to protect the honey. As for the engine, I had to make several modifications to it because to let the swarm of bees look more natural. Like I added such rules, like if in one cell there are like 20 bees, then the others tend to go to the neighboring cells, so not to pack them very dense. Okay, and one more implementation of liquids, of flows. It's not mine. It's from Komizart. He's the creator of Divide by Ship game, perhaps you know. So another implementation of fluid. He just created several bodies, like in Box 2D, several circle bodies, and then rendering them, they also look like fluid flowing through the pipes. Like that game about the crocodile, the same implementation. So, but now we are working with Unity, and we should move to the third dimension. So this model is very easy to implement for 3D. Instead of having a square cell, we can make a cube. And instead of having 4 points with vectors, we should have 8 points with vectors, with 3D vectors, and 8 interpolation coefficients. So instead of swiping the 2D space of a tablet, right now we are making a game with VR which will react to the hand. So what's the pros of this approach? I played many games about the wizards in VR, and usually what I noticed that these games implement the controller, and each spell which the wizard gives is a very long combination of push this button, unpush this button, move your hand here, and then the wizard fires a spell. But using the approach of implementing the snow physics, it makes the spells to work much more pleasant, like you whirl a hand, you create a whirlwind, and then you push a hand without the need to know which button to push. You just move your hand, and the environment, all these cells, all these cubed cells, they react to the movement of your hand. So we can go even further. Another approach of implementing flows and fields is to eliminate particles at all. So in these cases which we discussed, cells implement the particles, and particles influence the cells. But what if cells influence the neighboring cells? Here is the animated GIF of my strategy game, where the player controls the civilization, but doesn't control every unit, like every archer. Archers go here, knights go here, but just draws an arrow on the map, and the armies start invading. So how was this effect achieved? Here we have hexagonal cells, and the boundaries between the cells can be in one of 4 states. First, one can be average. Like if we have a certain number of soldiers here, the next turn they will be averaged. Then semi-value. semi-valve. If we have more warriors here than here, they will go inside. But if inside there are more warriors than outside, they won't go outside. So this allows us to gather more and more warriors every turn in the cell, surrounded by the semi-valve. Direction of flow, like regardless of how many warriors are here and here, they all go in this direction. And blocking, like no one goes between these cells. So the combination of these boundary rules, let's create such concepts from war, like direction of attack. Or, for example, the region where you will gather your defenses. The soldiers will gather in the region and will then stand their ground. So, and this lets create very mobile-friendly civilization controls. The game is now in beta. It has 100,000 installs, and I paused the development for a while to do some other tasks, but now I'm going to return to it and complete. So perhaps you recognized the concept which was behind this civilization, because it's studied in recreational mathematics or in computer is as cellular automaton. It was invented back in 1950s, and the most widespread cellular automaton is Game of Life, invented by John Conway. First, the game was played on board on a paper without computers, but in computers it was possible to make many interesting exploration in it. So here is how the Game of Life, the classic cellular automaton, works. The cells on the screen, on the grid, they have two states, alive or dead. And every turn, the number of neighbors is calculated. If the neighbors are 0, 1, or 4 up to 8, the cell dies. So if it was alive, if it was 1, then it turns into 0. If there are 2 neighbors, then the cell doesn't change its state. And if there are 3 neighbors, then the cell becomes alive. So these rules, you see, they are very simple. But these rules allowed John Conway to model something like living creatures who compete for space, compete for food, who fight each other, replicate themselves, and that's why this game was called Game of Life. So in my game, in Strategilization, how I call it, every process of civilization development is also a cellular automaton. There I showed you conquest, and here is exploration. Also, you don't need to think like in classic games to build a scout, to send a scout to one cell, to another, to third. You just draw an arrow, and here the numbers of cells sentry value, they are redistributed, recalculated, like unexplored land decreases the exploration of neighboring cells, and the arrow just moves your sentry point to other cells, and thus you control the exploration of the territory without the need to do this micromanagement. Here I just want to share with you a very interesting variant of Game of Life. It's called Larger Than Life. It was invented quite late with the help of computers. You see, they look like real bugs or something. And the rules are also very simple, just not 8 neighbors of a cell are taken into account, but the square of 7 by 7 is taken into account. At certain number of neighbors, one cell dies. At certain number of neighbors, one cell appears. So what's good in cellular automatons is that they can create order from chaos. This example shows the cell automaton called food chains. Like let we have n species of bacteria on the plane, and bacteria number 2 eats the bacteria number 1, bacteria number 3 eats the bacteria number 2, and so on, and bacteria number 1 eats bacteria number n. So they all are in such a food cycle. And if we start with random sequence, then a very interesting periodic structure will emerge. And right here I can show, this is my own variation of this food chain's cellular automaton. Here the odd numbers eat each other, and the even numbers eat each other as well. And such beautiful pictures of waves appear. This reminds me, I made this game in 2010. It's just like a relax game with no gameplay, but just to spectate beautiful images. And then, does anyone participate in Global Game Jam? Or did you participate this year? Just at the Global Game Jam, then I will tell you, that theme of Global Game Jam was waves. So I reminded of my game, just then shared it at Twitter. The people liked it again. So I was making a game just for me, and then it appeared that the players liked it connecting with the Global Game Jam theme. So, and one game which was made as a prototype, it's still staying in my folder of unfinished projects. Perhaps I will complete it. It's War of Bacteria. Like you also have like Game of Life, but with more complex rules. Like each bacteria has several parameters, like how long does it live, how much does it need to eat, with which probability will it create a descendant. And we have 2 different species, remove the wall between them, and they start fighting for the territory. The winning species then will be used in the next fight. And also thinking as flows helps me to organize the code of my current project. It's an idle game where you can connect some mechanisms, send energy. So to balance this game, I just drew a chart of interconnections between the elements, and then started making the coefficients which will allow for the system to be stable. So from my side, I can wish you great ideas, and perhaps you will use some real-world physics to find these great ideas and to let them lead to successful games. Thank you very much.